What's up, everyone, and welcome to Industry Icons. This is a new show that I'm doing on the channel where I do long-form interviews and I bring in some of the most exciting people and companies in the music industry. So these could be leading-edge engineers that do mixing and mastering, could be sound designers, or maybe companies that are making plugins, synths, headphones, speakers, all of the gear and tools that we use to create our art in music production. And I really come into contact with a lot of these people in my work, and I learn a ton from them. And there's these threads that I want to pull on and weave in here for all of you, because the relationships and the partnerships that I build, I'd like to be able to bring those people in, interview them, learn what we can about their mindsets, about how they approach what they do, and to be able to distill that down and share that with all of you so we can all learn together. This is going to be a regular show, so check back on the channel for regular updates, and I hope you enjoy this first episode. Stay tuned. I am here today to welcome a special guest, Ryan Schwabe. Ryan, thank you so much for joining us and taking some of your time.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on your podcast.
Right on. So, many of you will know Ryan through his work at Schwabe Digital. He is an incredible maker of some of the most exciting plugins in the industry, most notably GoldClip and more recently OrangeClip, and others, and more coming down the pipe. But Ryan also is a mixing and mastering engineer. He has been a prof at Drexel University and has been an avid teacher and sharer of knowledge. And big congrats, man, on the Grammy nominations. You have 2 Grammy nominations. I'll see if I can get them right this time. So it was Best Engineered Album was for Mixing and Mastering Bank Adolescence. And then you also had for Mixing and Mastering Best Electronic Album, and that was the Baauer Planets Mad, right?
That's correct. Yeah. That record I just mixed. I did not master that record.
Gotcha.
Matt Colton in, I think, Metropolis Studios mastered it.
Right on.
Was amazing. Yeah.
And for those of you who might not know, the Best Engineered Album, that is a really tough one to be nominated for. There's like 500-600 submissions for that one. It's all genres, is it not?
Yep, it's all genres. It's about 500-600 submissions a year, sometimes more. And it's just, electronic and pop music is rarely represented. Although this year TZO won for Best Engineered Album, which was really great. And it's like the final boss of audio engineering for me, and it was just really humbling. And it was really great timing because GoldClip was like coming out like 3 months later, so I was in LA just like meeting people and just telling everybody about GoldClip. So that's kind of how it got its foothold early as my first plugin, just because it was like coming off the back of some really successful just creative work on my side. Yeah, it was really serendipitous.
Right on, man. Well, yeah, aside from the Grammy nominations, you're a multi-platinum engineer. You've had tons of experience engineering music for people. And it's a real pleasure to be able to chat with you, man. Ryan and I kind of linked up on Instagram maybe a month ago or so. I had heard about GoldClip from David Nazi at Mixbus TV, who's an engineer that I really respect and follow. And he was talking about GoldClip, and I think he also was talking about OrangeClip. And so I was like, I was using other clippers at the time, but they had already become really integral to my workflow because I mix and master mainly electronic music, and so it's loud. Clippers are such a key part of the workflow if you're going to do clean loudness. And so I reached out and we kind of started a conversation on Instagram, and it turned into this. Now that I've gotten the plugins and I've been using them in my workflow, they are tools that I'm now using day in and day out. They've become mainstays. And
thank you.
I kind of can't live without them now. So,
thank you so much.
Yeah, man. We'll get into it. We'll get into why.
I think that conversation started. We were going back and forth about oversampling. I believe that was
we nerded out on oversampling.
Which is probably not an interesting enough topic for this podcast. But
interestingly enough, I published that video that I sent you, and I think it's sitting at a week at 20,000 views, and it's been the most popular video on my YouTube channel in the last month. It kind of blew up, and I've had lots of people that have been like reaching out that I haven't talked to in a long time. Like one of my old sound design teachers reached out and was like, "Hey man, I saw that video. What's GoldClip all about?" So
that's lovely.
Yeah.
Oh, I love that. I got to watch it again. I didn't know you posted that. Thank you for doing that.
Yeah, no worries. And more to come,
Yeah.
because a big focus for me in the YouTube channel over the next year is going to be talking about how to engineer music in a way that it can be clean and high fidelity and punchy, while also achieving loudness if you're in those types of genres where you want that really contained sound, and I am. So
Yeah.
yeah, man.
Yeah, that contained sound is a good way to explain it, because I often get people saying like, oh, I read like you should mix your music to like 14 loops. Why is this so loud? And I'm just like, that's a target playback volume for Spotify. It's not a mastering target volume for what's genre appropriate for that style of music. And for like rock records, not just electronic music, like rock records, electronic, anything that's like aggressive in nature, that containment is fundamental to the sound of what is appropriate. And so, that's kind of how I describe it as well, like the containment or like the cohesion of it. And it all comes from that final part of the process, that post-production process.
Yeah, exactly. And I remember, in my forays into talking about loudness on YouTube, of course, I've attracted some of the purists that have been like, you're destroying music, and like, I
Right.
can't believe you're advocating this, like you need dynamic range and you need crest factor. And, I've gotten involved in those conversations, but I always kind of remember it was a section of a David Nazi video where he was talking about crest factor and like how much crest factor do you actually need? Like, there's an amount of crest factor that is appropriate, and there's an amount of crest factor that's like, well, that actually needs to be contained a little bit. So, the crest factor thing is like, it's an interesting topic. So like, yeah, how would you describe like that balance of like loudness versus crest factor versus dynamics and stuff like that? What's kind of appropriate for the stuff that you're working on?
I mean, crest factor meaning the difference between peak and average, difference between peak and RMS leveling. So basically how much limiting, how much compression in the master file. It again is completely genre appropriate. If I'm doing, as a master engineer, I work in so many different genres of music. I might do a folk record, like a neoclassical record, which those both styles, like crest factor is going to be much more expansive, right? But even when I'm doing some of the neoclassical stuff, a lot of those artists are looking for a more modern sound. And so they might be like willing to push things a little bit more. And so it's really production dependent, genre dependent, and then mix dependent, right? Like some mixes, if there isn't, if it's like a really well balanced mix, you can get them to sound loud, sound punchy, and sound natural, right? But if there's like kind of incongruencies in the mix, like a really nice mix with a crazy loud tambourine, something like that type of stuff can become really problematic when you start to push it more. That's usually when I ask for mix revisions, which I rarely do as a master engineer, because I found it's not that I rarely do it. I do it when I'm asked to do it, but I don't do it if I'm not asked, because I feel like I'm intervening potentially in a whole thousands of decisions that I was not involved with, and I'm intervening, and it's the last stage. And if it's like a drastic change that they make right before they put out the record and then they start to regret it, it's like kind of, they might have demo, like it's like a macro form of demoitis, I guess, where they're like, oh, I kind of liked it messed up like that or whatever it is. So I only give mixed notes when asked, but I get asked often because they know that I'm both mixing and mastering quite a bit. So
people come to you because they respect your opinion and your artistic vision and your ears and all that
absolutely.
Stuff, right? Yeah,
absolutely.
Cool.
But like crest factor, I don't think about loudness too much, and I don't even look at meters too much, honestly. I work in a fixed gain environment, which is kind of like how, like films are mixed, where it's like one volume setting. And so my studio is set up where I only have a mute button for my speakers, and I don't ever change the volume. So I know how loud something is based off of how it's hitting my ears. And I have the same thing with my headphones too. I have a fixed gain for my headphones, which is kind of matched to my speakers. And So I'm not looking at crest factor. I may like at the end of a record, like when I print all the masters, I may like analyze them and see like how loud did I push it, just for referencing and like, kind of notating a numerical system to like what's happening in my studio to my ears. But I try not to look at that stuff too much.
Yeah, right on. I like the idea of the fixed gain environment. So you have basically a calibrated monitoring system so that you know when something's like mastered and it's sitting there at the loudest, it's going to be, what that sounds like. You don't have to look at meters for that.
Because I'm either only mastering records or I'm mixing, and 90% of the time mastering them as well. And so a lot of times the mastering process is baked into the mixing process.
Yep.
Sometimes I'll parse it out where I'll, basically be creating the master while we're mixing, but then I'll print all the versions with the final limiter off and then put that final limiter back in a separate session. And then if I want to put something in between, I do. But a lot of times, especially in electronic music, like there's such a difficulty in disconnecting the mixing and mastering process because it's all just turns into one thing, at least in my work with people. And so I've often just kind of clammed those two things together, and that's how it works. But yeah, the fixed gain environment thing has been really good for me because I was mixing a lot of records for a while and would just be turning things up too loud and just be making my ears ring, and I couldn't work for as long as I needed to. How much work was coming towards me, I couldn't do it. And so
you fatigue really quickly at those SPLs, right?
Yeah. And I was using like Focals at the time, which have a beryllium tweeter, and they're really like pointy sounding speakers, and they were really fatiguing. And then I like switched to the Key Audio 3s and using a Trinnov, which has an EQ in it. And so I'm able to like mix at like 79, 82 dB SPL and pretty much just stay there. I have like one trim plugin where I can turn it off and it goes like 4.5 dB louder. So it goes up to like 86 and I can like feel the bass real quick
for a sec. Yeah.
And then I go right back down. And as I use that, and then I have a pair of NS10s with a sub.
Which Focals were you using prior to the keys?
The Twin Bs or B Twin?
The Twin6 Bs?
Twin6 Be's, yeah.
It
was a long time ago. Yeah, they're great speakers. I made really good mixes on them. I had those in the sub with them, but I was just pushing them too much. I think I had to push them too much in my room. And with the keys, because they have the cardioid bass, I don't get as much of the nodes, so I'm not like having to push them as loud.
Yeah.
And it's just been a much more pleasing environment to work in.
Yeah, when I was putting my studio together, I evaluated the Focal Trio 11Bs, the big ones, the largest that they make, and the Neumann KH420s, and I got both sets and I listened to them probably for 3 months, and I couldn't handle the Focals. They were shrill up top. Like I shelved them all the way down as far as they would go, and I still needed to EQ them. And I've chatted with a lot of other people that have felt the same. Their tuning was just like, I don't know what the deal is with those. Maybe they're good if you have some high frequency hearing loss, but I could not monitor on those. I would just, all my high end would be garbage. And whereas the Neumanns were like, they're just on point. I love them.
They're a much smoother speaker, yeah. I think it's largely because of the beryllium tweeters that they have, which are that really light metal, and so they're very there's like a really high level of transient response from them in the high frequencies, and that's what bothers our ears is like really detailed transients and high frequencies, and I think they just overdid that, and they were probably bent in the wrong direction a little bit. But I wasn't EQing my speakers back then because I didn't really have the facilities to do it. I didn't have a Trinnov, and I didn't have, when I had those speakers, it was like 2016. There was the only thing that was really out in the consumer level was like the ARC system, and I tried it and it just didn't work for me. But so I was just working on them. That was just like open, and it was too much for me. I couldn't do it.
Yeah, I had those too, the Twin6 Bs. I was considering buying some used from a friend of mine, and so he lent them to me for about 3 months again. I just couldn't get on with them. But why don't we talk about clippers? So
cool.
That was kind of the main focal point in our initial conversations on Instagram, and I think it's really exciting using clipping in mixing and in mastering. So maybe we can just start off. I don't like assuming that anybody knows necessarily even what clippers are or like why you would use them. So maybe you could just kind of broadly introduce us to like, why do you like them and why do you use them? And then why did you start making them? We can get there.
Right. Well, what they are is it's basically it's doing the job of a limiter without time constraints. So without attack and release timings, because it's just using distortion. So it's like, instead of, there's soft clipping, hard clipping. Hard clipping is more associated with like digital technologies. Soft clipping is more associated with like guitar amps and like slower electronics, tubes and transformers, which kind of bend slowly go into clipping. And so what clipping is literally when you have a peak, you're literally clipping that peak off by you're reaching the maximum signal level of a device. And in this situation, a clipper is going to be like a distortion device. And when it's a hard clipper, it's pretty much just like a rectifier, which just means that like if it goes over the signal, it just flattens it out and it's all ones, right? And in some ways, OrangeClip, when it's at hard setting, it's a complete rectifier. It's a very simple thing. So essentially what it's doing is in a hard clipping situation, it's maintaining the integrity of the signal exactly like it is until it gets to a certain ceiling or threshold. And then at that point, it literally just prints flat ones there, right? Whether that is all the way up at 0.0 dBFS, which most clippers kind of sit at. In GoldClip, in OrangeClip, you can move where that flatlining happens. Totally. And then so in OrangeClip, it's a variable knee, so you can have it hard at 0.0, or you can have it soft at negative 51.8, which means that negative 51.8 is where like the tubes or the analog components that are slowly starting to saturate, slowly starting to limit, slowly starting to compress, they start to arc the signal into the flatlining, right? And so that process is basically pushing peak information down without the distortion effects from attack and release. When I say distortion effects, I mean like anything that augments a signal is considered distortion. But it is doing it with distortion. But usually what you're doing with a clipper is you're doing really minimal amounts of clipping, like 1 dB of clipping, a half a dB of clipping, 3 dB of clipping, right? And so those peaks are really, really instantaneous and short. And so it may be the attack of a snare drum, the attack of a kick. And because the clipper is interrupting the signal without any distortion from attack and release, it's adding really, really short bits of distortion into the signal. And those short bits of a distortion can give a perception of an enhanced transient because it's giving a quick burst of crunching, a quick burst of it's just like traditional distortion, right? And that traditional distortion, it's so short and instantaneous usually that it sounds more excited, and it doesn't really sound like, if I sent like a piano sustained note through a clipper, that's going to sound terrible, right?
Yeah. Anything pure tone or sustained, really, all you got to do is put a clipper on a pure 808 or something, and you'll hear it.
Right. But some, in artistic ways, that sometimes works, yeah. But like, as far as like the transparent aspects of it, not so much. And so generally in like a mastering situation, I use my clippers with zero clipping. Right. And so like if I'm mastering a record, I'm using GoldClip to do the gold processing, which is kind of like a wave shaping processing attached to the clipper. And what it's doing is bringing up low level information and maintaining the loudness of high level information, of peak information, right? And so it's essentially, when we talked earlier about crest, what's the crest level? What GoldClip and OrangeClip are largely doing is, in GoldClip's case, what it's doing is it's bringing up the RMS information closer to the peak information, right? And in OrangeClip's case, what it's doing is bringing peak information down closer to the RMS information. They're kind of doing opposite. They're different algorithms, but they're working in two different directions. GoldClip's going upwards, OrangeClip is going downwards.
Kind of like upwards versus downwards compression.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. OrangeClip is pushing peaks down towards RMS. GoldClip is pulling RMS up towards peaks. And so when I'm using GoldClip and mastering, I'll sometimes use OrangeClip and mastering as well in combination with them for like genre specific stuff like R&B and some club records or whatever, or rap records, whatever. But in GoldClip, what I'm doing is like basically pushing the signal right up till it's getting 0 dB of clipping, unless it's a really transient mix that I need to clip some of the stuff off. And then I'm just adding that gold processing, because then when I get the signal right up to the clip ceiling without doing any clipping, then I'm accessing the full knee curve of the gold processing. So it's getting that compression effect throughout the whole dynamic range of the signal. If the signal was down like 2 dB, it wouldn't be accessing the full kind of arc of the compression effect in GoldClip. And GoldClip is like a compressor, again, without attack and release. And that's why GoldClip sounds so good together, because it's a clipper with no attack and release augmentation, and then essentially like a wave shaper attached to that with no attack and release augmentation. So you're getting this loudness and you're getting the sustain. And I think that's what really like caught people's ear to it so much. And the interface is very simple and kind of elegant in the way that it's like set up.
Totally. Well, we've gotten into talking about GoldClip and OrangeClip. So why don't we just for people who might not have seen the plugins yet, why don't we do a quick introduction to each of them? So GoldClip came first. And you've aimed it more as it's got some really neat features on it that are, so it's kind of more of like a mastering or bus, a little bit more heavyweight type of clipper. So maybe you could fill us in on GoldClip and a bit of the introduction to that.
Sure. So it started from just like me mixing records and using a certain converter that had this soft saturation process on it. And, while I was working, mixing and mastering records, sending everything through this process, and it was taking all this time. And I just like thought like this could be in a plugin and it would be much more efficient. Right. And so I kind of went down this road of just like research for a while, and then like analysis, like sending tones through it and all that stuff. And then eventually built GoldClip. But what GoldClip is a 3 different clippers. It's a hard clipper and a modern and classic clipper. Modern's kind of like a hard clipper as well. Classic is a little bit more hairy and aggressive sounding because it emulates a device from the late 2000s that kind of had like a more edgy tone to it than the more modern device that it's emulating. And so it's 2 clippers, and then there's a hard clipper setting, which is literally just kind of like almost like a rectifier. It has a really kind of beautiful oversampling code in it that I spent tons of time and money investing in with my developer. I remember when I saw him, he was like, I'd never had somebody get so fussy about like 0.1 dB of overs, and us like trying to figure out how to manage all of this like detail about overs. And so the oversampling in it is so sophisticated that the threshold or the ceiling in is the output level out, and there's no overs from any of the oversampling process, which is a very big issue with a lot of oversampling coding.
And this was what I demonstrated in the video that we were talking about earlier. It was the only plugin that I was testing that didn't produce overs. And I know you and I have talked a lot about whether that's important or not. And I guess the reason why I think it's so important is because I'm using clippers, primarily OrangeClip, right? So all throughout my mix. And if I'm getting like sometimes 2-3 dB of overs from the oversampling process on like every snare, every kick, every tom, that shit adds up. And once that gets to your buses and your master, now all you have this accumulation of 5-6 dB of level, which is why I'm using clippers in the first place, is to reduce that peak level and create headroom for the mixing and mastering process. So So you did it, and it's if my terminology is right, they're anti-derivative, anti-aliasing filters, and the investment that you put into that paid off, because not only does it not produce overs, but it also sounds incredible. And I listened to it against every other clipper that I had on the master, and you can hear the difference.
Yeah, it actually like sounds better going through the oversampling process than not going through. It's quite strange. I remember when we were tuning it, we were like getting really into like the delay that it takes for the filters to do their processing. And like, we were like trying like a 8 millisecond, 16 millisecond, 64 millisecond delay associated with the downsampling filters. And like, we ended up just like choosing the really long delayed version, which is probably not good, but since it's a mastering device, it's not as particularly as big of an issue. And it sounded like even the developer was like, well, I didn't expect this to sound this much better using this long sample delay. So I guess I said that I didn't want to talk about new plugins, but like one of the things I am trying to develop as a derivative of GoldClip is a kind of a lighter, smaller version of it that will be packaged with GoldClip. That will be like called GoldClip Track, and that is going to be kind of like a reduced function set of GoldClip so that you can use it on like individual kicks and snares and tracks. So that's like something that I'm working on right now. And
that'll be useful because that's where,
yeah.
I mean, yeah, having the mastering clipper totally key, but then also like, I mean, I'm using it on in really loud stuff. I'm using the clippers on almost everything. I usually don't clip vocals. I usually don't clip sub unless it's like an artistic choice to texture it. But I mean, maybe, not
you should try OrangeClip on vocals is actually quite good. My friend Chris Tabron, like when I was asking, like he sent me a quote for his thing and he was like, OrangeClip on like a soft setting on vocals where you're not doing any clipping, but you're just wave shaping it down.
Right.
It's almost like it contains them and it almost acts like a de-esser in a way. It's quite wild what it does to vocals. And I've had other friends tell me about the using it on background vocals to like, shove them down. And it's been a pretty dynamic tool where I can use it on quite a bit of different things. But anyhow, so yeah, this GoldClip track is going to have like a reduced delay compensation. So it'll be a shorter delay compensation issue. And it'll just be like gold in the clippers and the input output gains. And, I'm just going to give it with everybody that owns GoldClip. It's going to come in the package.
Nice.
And I'm not going to sell it.
Lots of extra value. Because really, that's the ultimate approach is you need a track clipper and you need a master and bus clipper. So why don't we talk about OrangeClip then? Because you mentioned it a couple of times, and it's the newer one. And that's kind of that's what I saw pop up, and a lot of people have been asking, that I've seen just around the internet, YouTube, and stuff like that. What's it all about, and what inspired it, and things like that. So yeah.
I mean, I never thought I would put out another clipper because I thought it was foolish. And the next plugin I put out will not be a clipper, but. This came from a long history of me working in club music and rap music and working with producers that work in FL Studio. And that's that DAW just having a particular sound to it. And it's extremely unique. It's very singular. It's very familiar tone. Like just from like listening to popular music, you'll be exposed to it because so much music is made in FL because it for a while it still may be the most widely used DAW because it was extremely easy to get cracked for forever. So everybody that was in high school just starting to make beats used FL. And they just like stuck with it. And there's some processors in there that have this very specific sound, but you can only use them in that DAW. And so
native effects. So you're screwed if you're in another platform. Hey, yeah,
exactly. And so, it's just like just a default standard plugin in the DAW. And so I was doing some records with Toby Lou at the time. And, I've mentioned this story before, but he was like, asked me to like make this new version of a song with new vocals sound like the version that came out of FL. And I like could not, I was like, yeah, of course I can do that. And I could not do it. Like I kind of got it to work with GoldClip. If you like the trick in GoldClip is if you turn the clippers off and then you put it in classic mode actually turns into a clipper in itself, or modern mode does not. Modern mode's a different type of technology, but the classic gold, you can blast into it and it sort of does the thing, but it's not the exact same thing. And so I just wanted to make something that was just like freed people of that struggle, and because it was my struggle for a long time, and it's just a lovely sound. And so I built this to kind of replicate it, but I wanted to make it modern. I wanted to like put oversampling in it. I wanted to like make the user interface really easy. So there's like easy to like kind of see how much clipping you're doing, how much wave shaping you're doing, and manage, you know, like have more manageable gain structuring in it. To me, you know, like designing interfaces, you know, GoldClip and OrangeClip are largely similar in their interface design, and it's probably a design I'll use on many other dynamic processors that I make.
Please do, because it works, man. Like that's the thing is, I mean, I test plugins kind of for a living. Like I work with so many plugin companies, and as a teacher, educator, you know, YouTuber, I'm just constantly in manuals and stuff. And I can tell you there's a huge, I mean, one is I'm in a position to know what's a good interface and what's a bad interface. And you can have the best tool in the world, and sometimes it's so tragic, man, because I see something that's just such a good sounding plugin, and you just can't bring yourself to use it because every time you open it up, it's just working against you. And whatever the opposite of that is, you've done it. Like the most intuitive.
Thank you.
Like I read the manuals, and your manuals are just such a treat to read as well. Anybody who's getting these plugins, or even if you don't have them, download and read Ryan's manuals, because you're getting a Grammy-nominated engineer telling you how to do clipping. And like you put these little anecdotes in there. It's like, this is kind of a tip. This is how I do it. So like so many plugin manuals don't have that because they're written by a developer, not an engineer.
Thank you. That's very kind of you, man. Appreciate that, Drew.
It just stood out immediately. And the manuals, not only are they like dark mode, they just like, they're sexy to look at, but they're so well laid out, you know. But I didn't need to read the manuals to use your plugins, and that's a big testament to interface design. You know, I knew the basics of a clipper, and really a clipper is not a complicated device. I did, of course, had to read the GoldClip manual because I wasn't one of the hardware guys that used the original hardware, so I didn't know what some of the parameters were. But man, like the plugin interfaces are just a joy to work with. They do exactly what you need them to do. They don't have any extraneous features. You didn't bloat them with anything. You can get the job done quickly. Because when you're loading the stuff up, it's speed. You know, how quickly can you get results?
And I often get these, you know, comments from people, oh, you should add this feature, and you should add this button, and you should add this thing. And I'm like, you know, part of like product design is like limiting options to like the things that you need, and like having them laid out in a linear fashion that correlates to signal flow, where you can like get the results that you want in 5 seconds. Like my plugins look beautiful, but I don't want people to look at them for more than 5 seconds. You know what I mean? I want them to like just be so confident in what they're doing with getting the information as quickly as possible, just through like design practices, you know, like the way that the information is lined out. I usually have like a bar at the bottom that has like numeric responses and numeric responses at the top, and then the signal flow goes left to the right. And so you can kind of like just get the information, open it up, and close it really quick. And like working with developers, a lot of times they don't understand like why, like, you know, I have the ceiling and the linked input output gain. And I like behind the scenes, what those two things are doing is the exact same code. It's just a visual display of them on the interface doing them differently. So like if you pull threshold down or ceiling down 3 dB, it's actually like adding 3 dB of gain, going through all the processes, and then removing 3 dB of gain afterwards. And so like convincing a coder to like code something twice and then like put it in the interface 2 different ways makes them be like, why the hell are you doing this? You're making redundancies. And I'm like, this is actually not redundancies. This is a way that an engineer would think about clipping in a mixing process compared to maybe a mastering process. And so
agreed.
You know, I think there's a lot of things that like plugin companies are often just developed by deep coders, and they have no real engineering experience or music making experience, and it sometimes shows, you know. And so I hope to continue that process as long as my career in music keeps informing me of making good decisions. But I do have some really great in the next plugins I'm doing, which I'm not going to talk about, but they are a different philosophy, a different style of processor, not clippers, but they have a very similar aesthetic, but a completely different approach, because they're not clippers anymore. So
cool, man. Well, thanks for that kind of synopsis of them. So GoldClip is like, you know, it's the big daddy. It's the mastering clipper. It's on a lot of records. Like once people start using it, you'll start to understand like, oh, I've been hearing this and I didn't know I was hearing it. It's got a sound to it. And then OrangeClip is more like the quick and dirty track clipper, and it's got the sound of that particular tool. And yeah, it was interesting because I'd heard you tell that story before about how you got this mix and you were trying to recreate that sound, and kind of like, you're like, when you're a good engineer like you are, you're kind of like, yeah, I can make that sound. And you get into it and you're like, oh, actually, like, I can't make that sound because it's so unique. But then you found a solution which has now benefited the entire industry because you've given that sound outside of that DAW. And yeah, man, I mean, I think I was using K-Clip before this, and I still do like it. But the main reason I was using K-Clip as a track clipper was because it did something that almost no other interface did. And the interface is what it is, but it did a gain link. And so like I was wanting to just press link. I wanted to push up my signal. And in K-Clip, the ceiling is different than in GoldClip. You can't just pull the ceiling down. The ceiling is a non-oversampled secondary clipping stage to prevent overs from the oversampling, downsampling process. So they say in the manual, don't pull the ceiling down. I would, because I typically do non-oversampled hard clipping on stuff. But but in and then you that same workflow was in OrangeClip. I was like, I don't want to use a clipper where I have to push something up and push something else down. It takes me literally twice as long. And so like the gain link was like fabulous. Yeah.
Yeah. Just those little things, I mean, I'm always trying to be, when I'm mixing records, I'm always qualifying everything I do, right? Like I make a creative decision that's like based off of my echoic memory of records. Like I think this needs to sound like this. And then I test that by turning it on and off, right? And in any situation where the plugin is like not making it easy to manage whether that's the same volume or not, it is screwing with my decision making and it's slowing me down, and I generally don't use it because it's fatiguing to me, because I'm trying to make 1,000 decisions fast in order to mix a record in a timely manner that's not laboring over. And so like those design aesthetics are really, really important to me, and I'm just surprised that they're not in every plugin device. I mean, I've had plugins, I don't remember what it was, but some of them you just insert them and it makes it like 0.3 dB louder, because you're like, oh wow, it sounds better.
Yeah, like everything that Waves has ever made.
yeah. I think ridiculous. I got it from a couple of Slate plugins as well, but
yeah.
But no shame to Slate Digital because I stole their name. So
yeah. But yeah, I mean, I did that. I tested a bunch of Waves plugins once, and I was like, I actually gain matched them, and I was like, oh, it sounds worse with the processing on.
Yeah.
And I was like, why was I using this before? And I was like, oh yeah, because it adds 3 dB of gain every time you put it on. And I was like, I can't respect companies that do that. It's I think in that case, it's kind of a marketing ploy.
And this is like in the weeds, but when I was developing GoldClip and I was trying to get that oversampling technology right, like my first solution was, before rewriting the entire because I put it out with certain oversampling, and then I rewrote the entire plugin for version 1.2.2. And before I decided to rewrite the whole thing, we were like trying to do all these things to get input equal output, and like we were literally turning down the output signal like 0.3 dB so the overs wouldn't go over. And it was just like, this is, now people are going to turn on the plugin and it's going to be quieter. Like people are just going to think it sounds worse. Yeah. And so I was just like, nah, we got to rewrite this whole thing. And so then we rewrote the whole thing. So that's like, in the weeds of developing plugins, like those like tiny details are massively expensive to develop and massively difficult to like get right. But those are the kind of, as an engineer, those are the details that like I can't sleep with, I was like, this is unacceptable, and that's why I'm pretty slow at developing plugins, because it takes a while to kind of get that level of precision and correctness in the products.
Yeah. And the quality over quantity over speed approach, I think is better in the long run, right? Because people can tell when you're a company that just cranks out plugins and you've got a plugin every day of the week, and then you get all the influencers on it. It's like, I talk with a lot of different engineers, and I was chatting with Nicholas DiLorenzo from Panorama Mixing and Mastering last week, and we were like, you don't need 25 compressors and 17 EQs, and maybe some plugins you need a lot of, but like, you can really get the job done knowing a smaller set of tools at a deeper level.
When I'm mixing, I'm using, I mean, sure, I got like a lot of different like effects and delays and reverbs and stuff, and phasers and flangers and whatever, but you know, like as far as like stuff I'm inserting on a track, I'm like inserting like one of 10 things. That's it, you know?
Yeah. You have your go-to
It's
workhorse
really,
tools.
yeah. And some of them are like 20-year-old plugins, you know, like, so
Right on.
yeah. Yeah.
So one question that I have come up a lot from people who are new to clipping is, clipping is a way of transparently or not transparently reducing peak level.
Sure.
And it's one of several tools that could do that. So could you compare and contrast using clipping, and you could talk about soft and hard clipping versus using compression versus using a saturator and versus using a limiter? Those kind of 4 different tools can all be used in similar ways, but yeah, I'm curious if you could discuss that a bit.
So, I mean, I usually use a clipper in combination with a limiter in a mastering situation, right? And so, usually I'm clipping as like first in chain. And so I know where the peaks are of the mix, and I'm kind of like just setting the initial gain staging of it. And then it'll go through some other things, EQs, compressors, maybe saturators or tape things or whatever I'm trying to do that's appropriate for that genre, and then hitting a final limiter. So, in like a mastering situation, it's always in combination with the final limiter, because that's where I can like set the headroom, and I can get like there's some more parameters on a limiter that lets you tune the way that it interacts, how much kind of it pumps, or how slow the attack is to kind of let transients of kicks and snares through, or have them be really contained. You can kind of, in combination with a clipper, is really, really effective, as you know.
And you're putting it first in chain to kind of get rid of the odd spurious kind of peak, so that you're
Right.
feeding your dynamic range sensitive effects on the mastering chain downstream of the clipper a bit more of a consistent signal without these like one snare that might pop up a dB or two. Yeah.
Exactly. So I'm snipping off like a dB of stuff, and then I'm maybe adding some nonlinear gain with gold processing, which is kind of inflating or increasing the sustain of low frequency information, or any information really. And then that more controlled signal, because it has the gold compression in it and it has the clipping to reduce the peaks, I may then go into, if I wanted to make it move a little bit, I may use like a compressor that's filtering out the low frequencies to make it kind of move to the attack of the kick drum, like the 190 and up or 180 and up. And then the rest of the music, the mid-range. So it's then just kind of balancing out the mid-range to lift the mid-range and push it forward. And so it's oftentimes in combination with things. OrangeClip is a little bit different because it acts more like a compressor when you're having it on a soft setting. And so if I have like instruments that are sustained or background vocal, like a gang of background vocals, or even vocals, or just main lead vocal, and I want to like push the peaks down so that I get increased loudness, I will kind of set those so that they are, just kind of rounding those peaks off, and just kind of like, if I want them more aggressive, I'll go to hard. If I want them more kind of soft and cozy, I'll make them more round. And so sometimes it's a better form of compression than like, inserting like our comp or something like that. Just because it doesn't have any attack and release. It adds some harmonics to it, so it's making things brighter. And so, most compressors, digital type compressors, like an our comp or whatever type of digital channel strip compressor, they're generally pretty clean. The only distortion that they're adding is the effects from the attack and release. And so it depends on what your goals are in the situation. But like things that are traditionally transient, like kick drums, snare drums, definitely snare drums, and things like that, I'll clip a little bit just to like slowly kind of push all the peaks down, so that by the time you get to the master fader and the master bus processing, that stuff has less, as you were saying earlier, less like transient information that it has to duck into and kind of gain reduce out. Yep. So I don't really use them as a replacement really to anything. I use them as a complement to everything. And so a compressor, a limiter, because sometimes what I'll do is I'll clip it to get the transients out, and then I'll reanimate it with a compressor, with a slow attack kick drum, like, like 30 or 50 millisecond attack to make it kind of like pop through, because then like you kind of like controlling it and giving it some hair, and then you're making it bounce a little bit, right? And that's to me what it's all about, is like maintaining peak information and then animating the kind of RMS a little bit, right? And so I wouldn't say that I use them as a replacement to anything. They're almost always a complement. And that's why I built GoldClip. When I was building GoldClip, I was like, oh, this isn't, I just thought it was like a good product idea, because it isn't like a replacement for a limiter. I'm not trying to say like, this is the best limiter ever. I'm like, you can use whatever limiter that you think is the best in the world, but this is something that you can put in front of your limiter and it'll make your limiter work like 20% less hard. Right.
And aren't limiters also using clippers? Like, because any mastering limiter is going to have oversampling in it, they have to, at the end of the chain of the limiter, they have to have a non-oversampled clipper, do they not?
Not necessarily. I know some of the algorithms in Isotope are clippers, but the way that like a true peak limiter works is it's kind of limiting based off of the assumed peaks that will be created based off the information that's feeding into the limiter. Right. It's kind of, I don't really use true peak limiters.
Me neither. Can we talk about that for a sec? I always ask people this. I'm like, and there was like this famous debate between, I think it was Ian Stewart and Steve Slate about true peaks. And I was like, I never use TPL because I never hear true peak overs distortion. I play back all my stuff, and my stuff sits at like +1, +2 true peak when I'm done mastering it. And I go and I play it back on every system. I have a whole bunch of Bluetooth speakers, my phone, 3 laptops, my car. I never have once heard a true peak over on any of those systems.
Yeah, I think it counts as a true peak over if it's 3 samples in a row that are at 0.0 dBFS, all +1s, all 24 bits of ones. Then it says, okay, this is a true peak, so then we have to do more limiting here, right? And so it's basically like taking a data set and then doing limiting on information rather than like what it sounds like. It's just kind of like
actually
making
hear
assumptions. Yeah. So my solution is to just like, I have my limiters, which, a lot of people don't do this, but I set my limiters at like -0.5. So I have a half a dB of headroom.
Yeah.
And then I put another limiter after it that's at like -0.1. And so if there's overs that happen from whatever, that last limiter is going to catch them. And then it also puts some teeth on the waveforms, right? And so I'll sometimes like let things through, or I'll animate things in between those 2 limiters so that I can like recreate some expansion, and then that last limiter catches it. And so I don't even look at true peak, because I know, and when I listen to the records I make on streaming, they sound great. So I just don't think about it,
And those limiters that you're using, are you using oversampling in either of those limiters?
I don't even know if Isotope. I'm using Isotope for both of them, the maximizer.
Yeah, it doesn't indicate any oversampling setting. I don't know if they're doing oversampling under the hood, but I've gone and investigated in Ozone before, and I can't find any mention of oversampling in the limiter.
Yeah, I don't think it does oversampling, honestly.
It's weird because the DMG doesn't. That's one of the big conversations we had, was the Limitless doesn't have oversampling except in its TPL stage. It does. It does oversampling to be able to detect true peaks. But
I tried to love that limiter, and it fails me too often. I had to stop using it. But I know a lot of people love it, but I don't know. Just like, it's too tweaky. It's too much stuff to fuss around with.
It's a deep plugin. I use it a lot. I've tested it all the time against other plugins, and usually I find it sounds a bit more open, and it's doing less work to get the job done. And it produces less aliasing than any other limiter I've ever tested. Maybe the Sonable Smart Limit actually is in the same ballpark. But I get on with it quite well. I've talked to, engineers either love it or hate it. I've talked as well to a few other people that are like, I just never got on with it. I use this or that. Or
I think it's the multi-band aspect of it. Like, it does too much pushing and pulling. Like, maybe I should try to use it with like not using the multi-band as much, because I just feel like the multi-band just like re-EQs way too much during the limiting process. And you could tune it obviously to like
you can
do a goal that you have, but it's like, it just seems like a bit erratic for me. But I should retry it without you relying less on the multi-band aspect of it.
Yeah, if you take it and you take the separation parameter and you turn separation to 0, then band interdependence is 0 and it becomes a single band limiter. And actually, that's one of my favorite plugins from DMG is DMG Track Limit, which occasionally,
I love that one.
Yeah, and that's the same algorithm as Limitless. It's just single band. So,
nice.
Yeah, I use that one a lot because I find when I'm clipping, if I try and clip kicks or subs or vocals, lead vocals, a lot of times I'm like, oh, it's getting a little too, I'm hearing it too much. And then I'll go to track limit on stuff like that. And I find it catches that stuff and is able to reduce peak limit or peak level.
Nice.
In a way that I'm like, yeah, that's good. And then I clip everything else. So that's kind of the only places where I'm using a track limiter versus a track clipper.
Nice.
I did want to circle back to something, which was, what's your take on the differences between saturation and clippers then? Because they can kind of verge into the same territory, right? Like a saturator is usually inflating low-level material, and then it's a rounder, knee on it that looks very similar if you look at the transfer function to a soft clipper.
I mean, a saturator is like a pretty wide term because, like Spectre is a saturator, but that is basically a distortion device, 5 different distortion devices that you can blend in, or, Decapitator is a saturator, but it's not really, it's a clipper only because it's a distortion device. So, I mean, like a distortion device and a clipper are largely the same thing. It's just like when they start to distort, right? And so a hard clipper, like, it doesn't distort at all until it's 100% distortion, which means it's completely clipped off, right? And it's just creating harmonic content. All right, so this is the back of my studio now.
Yeah, right on.
It's really about the design of the interface, and like distortion devices are essentially wave shapers, right? They're just like changing the waveform in a myriad of different ways through different like mathematical functions. And clippers are really just about where that distortion starts and how it's introduced, and then how extreme it gets, or how fast it gets to be extreme, to become a hard clipper. And so, you can't really use what's a traditional saturator device like Decapitator like a clipper, because it's going to be so hairy throughout the entirety of the signal, because it's doing so much wave shaping so early, so low level. And so,
right. So that would you'd contrast between soft clipping and like a Decapitator, because on soft clipping you could still have the bottom, the low level stuff kind of like not affected if it's below the rounded knee. Whereas with the Decapitator, you are really hearing it in the low level information right off the bat. Hey,
right.
Okay,
exactly. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that nuance is really important, and but I agree with something that you said earlier wholeheartedly, which is I don't use compression as much anymore because a lot of times the clipping, or if I'm using saturation on tracks, is taking the place. Like, what do I use a compressor for? Usually, it's to reduce dynamic range. It's to inflate low level material with makeup gain, or if you're doing upwards compression, and it's to provide containment. And a lot of times I'm finding I'm getting that by using a combination of hard and soft clipping on some of the sounds. Yeah. So I'm using compression so much less now, actually. And even on my master, I test with compression on and off on my masters. And most of the time I actually like the sound of the master without compression on, which is a weird phase to be in. And,
I mean, mixes are so loud and so manipulated that like I rarely use compression in mastering either. I mean, I have a few mastering compressors in chain, but I rarely use them, and if I do, it's like in parallel or something. Just to like kind of like accentuate transients. And so it's just like everything's so loud nowadays, you just don't need compression like that.
Yeah, totally. Well, I found now with, when I'm mixing heavy electronic stuff, like drum and bass and trap and dubstep and glitch hop and stuff like that. Like the most recent mix that I did which was actually, I'm hoping we can film a video on this in the future, because I took a mix where I'd done everything, and then I ripped out all the clippers and I replaced them with OrangeClip and GoldClip just to see what the difference was like. Yeah.
Oh, wow. What was that like? Tell me.
It was awesome, man. It was great. It was actually very fast because of the gain linking. And I just, I was doing primarily transparent hard clipping of micro transients. So I was being really gentle with the clippers. I was taking out, a couple dB here and there, just these micro transients that are like 2, 3, 4 samples long.
Yeah.
And then I used some soft clipping on the sounds where it lent to soft clipping. So sometimes I would hard clip and then put another instance of OrangeClip and soft clip after that, where I wanted a bit more audible harmonics and tone shaping, and then on my submixes on my buses, I was using sometimes GoldClip, sometimes OrangeClip. Nice. And the mix, when I turned it out, the mix was a -11 LUFS in the drops. So Spotify's already turning that down. And then the master was louder, and it was clean, man. It was just,
that's good.
I put this mix on YouTube, and the master on YouTube, and I demonstrated the original mix that had no clipping at all, that the artist had given me, and then the one that I'd done with OrangeClip and GoldClip. And I was able to increase the amount of bass in it as well, a huge increase in the amount of low information, and pushing it louder at the same time. And I was really happy with the result. I think it sounds really clean. I'll send it to you. You can let me know what you think.
Yeah, I would love to hear it. Yeah, I mean, I didn't really do a lot of clipping before I built those clippers, because I had K-Clip for a while. Like, I had the old version, and it was like so CPU aggressive. Like, it didn't really work that well, but I know the new one's good now.
It's lightweight.
Yeah. And then I had, what was the other one? Submission audio.
Standard clip is a big one. Newfangled audio makes the saturate plugin.
That one's nice. I like that one.
That one's nice because it's got the detail preservation, the spectral clipping, right? Which is that's something that sets it a little bit apart. So I will use it sometimes.
Yeah, I like that.
More often than not, I'm finding I'm just sticking with OrangeClip and GoldClip actually when I A/B them.
Nice. Yeah, but I never really used clipping too much. Like in the the Baauer record for Best Electronic Music, I don't think I used clipping really at all on that record. That was before I developed GoldClip. And it just wasn't totally necessary. I was just getting there with like EQ and compression and like really amazing productions. You know what I mean? And like sometimes like me mixing records, like when you have a producer that's like really good, like part of it is staying out of the way. I looked at those mixes and I was like one plugin on each track, maybe a couple, 20% of the tracks, no plugins at all, just leveling and maybe panning. And it was like
the production is there.
Yeah. And you can't go, when I'm mixing records, I can't go returning like foreign objects to people. Like I need to return them the same artistic idea, just like 20% more hype. You know what I mean? And so, a lot of times like my approach is like, I want to do as little as possible as a mix engineer and get all of my kind of echoic ideas, all of my like things that I'm hearing in my head done. And so like, I'm never stacking plugins that's like one thing's like adding top end and the next thing's like taking away top end, and like, doing these like inverted processes that just like I just find the more and more plugins you add, the worse stuff sounds, right? The more and more bussing that you do, the worse stuff sounds. And so like my mixes, they go straight to the 2-bus. Sometimes they get split to like a music and vocal bus before it, but those don't have any processing on them. And maybe like halfway through I might do something to them, but they're just there so I can like, if I need to quickly like raise all vocals, I can just raise all vocals.
Gotcha.
But yeah, I mean, I love everything just going straight to the 2-bus. I do have like a parallel kind of like distortion on the 2-bus that I'll do often, like overloading like tape emulations and overloading just like some fuzzy stuff. And then
Bobby asked you about that one, right? I remember you talking to him about that in your podcast.
Well, I do a lot of parallel distortion in my mixes so I'll have like parallel distortion on drums and bass and music tracks, and then I'll have a parallel distortion on the mix bus as well. And so both those like vocal and instrument buses go to a parallel track that's like blasted, but then it's like down at like -30 dBFS. So when you turn that on and off, it's kind of like this bed of, grit and cohesion that holds things together, and it sounds really lovely. And you know, obviously you tune it a little bit for each production, but it's rare that I ever have to turn it off.
And what are you using? You're using something plugin based. What tool are you using there? You find is your go-to?
That's all plugins. Honestly, I use the Waves tape machine often. There's like a saturation on there. What is it called? Just like that garbage tape emulation plugin from them. Maybe it's the Abbey Roads one or something. I forget. And then I use Phoenix. I overload Phoenix after that to like kind of catch some of the high frequencies. And then I usually like high pass, low pass it and make it just like mid-range oriented. And so it's just like between 200 and like 3K or something like that.
And you'll use a linear phase cut filter.
Yeah.
To be able to do that, so you're not getting any rotation on the parallel. Yeah.
Right. And yeah, it's just like it just like makes things sound better right away. I've been doing much more like top-down mixing lately, where, you know, if I know I'm going to be mastering that track as well, I like kind of put the stems in there, match the demo, master it really quick, like get it loud, and then like do a bunch of colorful bus processing that I might want to do on that record, whether it's like using Spectre or, you know, Vintage Warmer, or just like some plugins that kind of just like spice things up a little bit, get it a little bit like nasty sounding. And then go in and mix, be like, all right, what's the weakest link? This hi-hat is super harsh, do something there. This bass line is not sustaining right, let's do something over there. This kick drum is like way too clicky, let's chill that out. You know, and then I'll like go through and then, you know, fix problems downward. And then that allows me to like maintain the vision of the artist, but then start to just like solve problems first, get all those problem solves, and then do creative things like, you know, like, one of the last things I'll do after I, you know, like kind of add all these stuff to get the mix to where it needs to be. And then I do all my cleanup stuff. Then I just kind of like listen through the song. I'm like, all right, on the intro, like what movement can I put on the intro to make this interesting from a mix perspective? So like each section, I'm like, what, like I call it like, you know, secret decoration can I do behind the scenes of like things moving, whether it's like things panning or delay effects, or like some sort of ear candy in almost every section, but none of them are a distraction. None of them are like, I heard that thing. It's just like some bits of movement throughout each section. So I'll go through, do all that. And then, you know, all the automation that goes along with that. And that's usually kind of like my workflow and then I just try to stay out of the way, because that's the move.
Yeah. Key move is preserve the art, preserve the artistic vision, and don't step on that. Funny story about Vintage Warmer. I met the guys from PSP at NAMM a few years ago, and they were they gave me a little bottle of Polish vodka. It had like they had the Vintage Warmer logo on it. They were like, here's the analog edition.
Classic.
Polish Vintage Warmer.
That's funny.
I'm sitting there in like Anaheim and like, you know, 80-degree weather.
That's awesome. Yeah, I haven't met them. I like that plugin though. It's nice.
It's an old one.
Yeah,
I had that for years, but it's good. Yeah, because it's got the tape simulation, right? So it's warm, and that's one that adds so much gain though, man. Holy, I remember putting it on. I was like, everything sounds so hype. Oh wait, it's 6 decibels louder.
Yeah. One of the things I do is I always make like default presets for plugins, and then I also make like gain structured plugins. So like plugins like that, I'll make like presets that are like +3, +6, you know, like more and more aggression. But I like with a sine wave and a meter, like create all them so that they're perfectly unity pass through. And so I do that with like Phoenix and all those like ones that just don't have any type of gain management, like automatic gain management. I create presets for all those. And that's been super, super helpful.
Big time. Yeah. One of my favorites for speaking of saturation is the Black Box Analog Design HG2MS, the Brainworks version.
Yeah.
And, you know, of course it adds a lot of gain, but that thing's like, it's like a sports car. It's like an old sports car. It's like, it's manual. It's like, you got to gain match it. And you need to be on that so that you're not fooling your ears just with loudness. But I really like that plugin. And it's great.
One of
Just got to turn it down.
the person that's coding my next plugin actually coded that plugin.
I heard that.
Yeah,
Yes.
he's really good. He's dope.
He's a genius, hey?
Yeah,
Yeah.
he's
Right
really
on.
brilliant.
Sweet.
But yeah, that gain management thing is like such a major part of, especially when you're working, if you're mixing your own art, you can do whatever you want to it. But when you're like working with artists and there's like this precision that needs to happen between like all of your decision makings and all the things that you add as a mix engineer, it's just such a fundamental part of like being a good mix engineer is like knowing how to do that. Like I was talking to my friend Ben Thomas, and he was saying that like one of the things that maybe he doesn't want people to talk about this, but he like takes note of all the levels of all the instrument stuff. He needs to go back to the original mix level. He can like go back to it and like know exactly where home was. So it's just like a really big part of interacting with artists, as you know, and that's why it's built into GoldClip and OrangeClip. So
yeah, the unity function, right? So you can make equal perceived loudness comparisons.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, man, 100%. Like I've looked at the research into the the acoustics research into the just noticeable difference in terms of loudness, and you know this too. It's different depending on what type of material that you're listening to. If it's noise, pink noise, a transient, a vocal, but it's somewhere between 0.2 and like 0.8 decibels, right? It's like a really small amount. So if a plugin is doing even that, you're going to prefer it. I did a video about a couple weeks ago called "Loudness Trumps Everything," and it was kind of an inflammatory title, but it was actually the name of an AES journal article about how these little differences in perceived loudness fool our ears, and it really does trump a lot of other things like the quality of processing unless you account for that.
100%. There's that one plugin by Ian Shepherd that is a AB plugin that you like put one plugin at the top of the chain, one plugin at the bottom of the chain, and then it does the loops management between the two, and you can AB and you can like do a direct comparison so that like it kind of nulls out all the volume changes from plugins. That
does it work well?
It works really well. Yeah. I mean, that was kind of the start of GoldClip. I would use that plugin at the top of the chain, and then I would put my hardware insert in between, and then I put the second plugin after it, and then I'd have it analyze the loops, going through the hardware, going through all the soft set on the Lavery, and then it would gain manage so that it would match evenly. So then I would just I could be really reckless with my analog, just like blast EQ, blast compression, and then just have it gain match the perceived volume with a loose meter, short-term loops. And then it just matches the wet to the dry, and you can AB the dry really quick. And then I would just commit that whole channel going through the gain management of that plugin, and then also the hardware. And that was kind of like the build. That was like the original kind of inspiration for making the plugin, because it was great, but it would just take a long time to
too long to route everything out and back in again.
Yeah,
totally.
Exactly. Yeah. So
I had a thought. I just wanted to kind of complete on the clipping thing, which was, what do you think are some of the pitfalls that people get into with clipping? What are some of the mistakes that people make when they maybe start foraying into using clippers in their process for mixing and for mastering?
Doing too much of it. I mean, it's always, one of the things people do is they'll just, or like when they're comparing clippers, they'll compare, they're like, well, if I do 10 dB of clipping on each one and I decide which one sounds better, then that one's better. And it's like, well, that's not how you actually use it. Like if you use it at doing 1 dB of clipping, which then you actually have to be really attentive to the psychoacoustic differences, or to the dynamic changes, what sounds better at that level. But I I would say over clipping and kind of too much of clipping, right? Just so you don't need to clip every track. It's really just stuff with erroneous transients. So that's going to be kicks and snares and percussion instruments.
Short audio events. You don't want to be digging into the RMS of everything with a clipper.
And so, I get a lot of comments, there's, I guess clippers get a bad name because A, there's so many of them, and B, people just think that they're just make music sound bad, and they can make music sound bad if you're hyping the hell out of the music with clippers, right? It's going to sound distorted and ugly and smeary, and it's not ideal. So, I mean, generally people, I feel like they just do way too much of it. And like, because I mean, like me, like when I'm mastering a record, I use almost 0 dB of clipping 90% of the time, right? I'm just using it to like maybe clip off a half a dB, 0.2 of a dB, 0.3 of a dB. And then I'm using like the gold processing. To me, that's really the magic of GoldClip is that particular processing. And I'm using it with Unity on, so that it's pushing down the peaks. And so it's just creating more headroom for my limiter to have to work less. But yeah, I mean, I think with everything in life, it's just people doing too much of it. Whenever I get a new plugin, I use it too much, right? And so to me, people think clipping is the be all end all of like making things loud. And it's like, it's actually it's best to use it like in subtlety. So that would be it. What about you?
Yeah, what do I think are some of the mistakes people make with it?
Yeah.
I would definitely echo you in saying too much. Using it on too many things. Like there are some things that just don't clip well. And then there are some people that are just so into clipping that it's like a religion for them, and they think that not only do they think sometimes that everything needs to be clipped, but there's been some recommendations that people choose sounds to use in production based on how much clipping they can take. And I'm like, that's stepping on the art, man. That's like loudness for loudness's sake. And it's not just about pushing everything into clippers all day long and seeing how loud you can make it.
Interesting.
There's
I never heard
underlying, underpinning things. Yeah.
I have not heard that one. That's interesting. Yeah. I mean, everything that I do, like I work in subtlety, like I try to make things really transparent, and like I try to like hide and like do kind of work that is like more sensed than like overt. And so I'm always like, and that comes probably from like doing mostly mastering work. And so like in my mixing work, like I'm going to clip a few things, but for the most part, I'm going to like, a lot of sounds are already clipped to begin with, like drums and stuff from libraries. A lot of that stuff's already snapped out. So, I try to keep things subtle.
Yeah, exactly. I find when I'm getting a summing point, I'm looking for those little stray peaks that are just like, you figure out where's your average peak level, and then these little micro transients that are exceeding the average peak level. I look for those, and they might happen every bar, every 8 bars.
Yeah.
And in some cases, what I've been doing on the once I export the mix, is instead of even using a clipper on the master, or before I use a clipper on the master, I'm loading it up in Isotope RX audio editor, and I'm doing manual limiting. And so I'm going through and I'm using the waveform statistics function to find where the sample peaks are. I'm looking at it, and if they're like 2, 3, 4 samples, I just highlight them and use negative 2 dB gain or whatever it needs and push them down. It maintains the waveform, and there's zero distortion from that. I think maybe Bob Katz talked about that. I learned this more from Nicholas DiLorenzo. Actually, he has some good videos on RX and how he does that to prep for mastering sessions. And then I find if I am using the clipper like that, I'll typically still use GoldClip at that point, but I'm clipping like a dB, like you said, or 2 dB sometimes.
Wouldn't that make an asymmetric waveform? Wouldn't that make an asymmetric? If you're gaining down a wave file as it's progressing through samples, it would be like asymmetric, no?
It's wave shaping it.
Oh, okay.
I mean, basically it's the same thing. It's pretty similar to how Limitless works. Limitless and the track limit from DMG, it calculates one gain adjustment per sample. And so it's kind of a manual limiting process is kind of how it's been described to me and how I would look at it. And yeah, you want to make sure that you're not hearing it, but it's taken similar to a limiter with a little tiny bit of look ahead. It's able to grab that peak in the waveform, and then you can choose between left and right. So you can choose to just rein in one channel if that's what the channel that's going over, like similar to 0% stereo interlinking and things like that. So
interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I only started using RX for stuff like that maybe like a year ago or so, but I've been liking it. Again, I only fuss with that stuff for really, really loud stuff.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah,
like
I never have a trouble getting things loud. I think the one thing I do use RX for is like manual de-essing. So I'll like go through, if a record is like particularly SE, I'll load it into there and go through and section by section de-ess. That's one thing that I think is like a really good use for RX, but I haven't done any like dynamic processing in there. I'll have to check it out.
yeah, yeah.
Nice.
Sweet.
Nice.
Could we talk about your listening environment in your studio a little bit?
It looks terrible. It's falling right now.
Yeah, because we had to flip around. But I know, you and I have talked a little bit, and you used to design studios, and you built some rooms kind of early on in your career, right, when you were with Drexel.
Yeah.
And then of course, you realize like, oh man, it's like such an ordeal to get into construction of those big projects and stuff like that. But you have a neat room at your home, and so you've gone for the studio in your house. You've gone for not building like a no windows control room like I have here. You've gone for like, you have natural light. You can see some exposed walls, and it looks like a really neat space. And you've been able to do that by using some like cutting edge technology. You've got the keys, which are cardioid monitors. They're not throwing rearward bass a lot, and you've got the Trinnov. So yeah, I'd love the big thing is that, you can't mix what you can't hear. So like, yeah, right. Tell me about your studio and your listening environment.
Absolutely. So I have like kind of like an attack wall type setup, but you can't really build an attack wall with the key threes because they need like sound to be able to emanate all the way through them. And an attack wall, traditionally, you're like building a wall around the speakers to make essentially a soffit mounted situation. But what I have is, I have a room it's very symmetric in the way that it's laid out. And I have kind of three panel like false walls on the sides with freestanding pads, which kind of like act as like sound guides. They kind of project the sound towards the rear as like a amphitheater would.
And are those filled with porous absorption?
Yeah,
those modules?
That's porous absorption with a like 1/8" wooden panel, slotted panel on them. And so it's basically reflecting higher frequencies, absorbing lower frequencies to some degree, although it's fabric.
It's like a range limiter on the front, kind of beneath the fabric. I couldn't tell because they're wrapped in fabric, right? But so you've got a range limiter underneath those. Yeah, gotcha. Okay.
And then, first reflections are all kind of taken care of, sidewalls, ceiling, and floor. The back wall is this diffuser that's falling down right now because I was moving things around to put my camera up and didn't think that I was going to be showing the back wall of my studio. But in the back, I have, NS10s and another monitor and keyboard. So I can like work in the main part of the studio on main speakers, and I can turn around and be on NS10s, same mouse, keyboard. They're just on opposite sides of the room. It's an amazing sounding room. It's not a huge room. It's like 15 by 14 or 15 by 17. I forget the exact dimensions. I have a bunch of analog gear in here, but the acoustic setup, the main thing that makes it really, really work is the symmetry of it. And then the combination of the key threes and the Trinnov. And so, I have it set up in a digital setup. I have 2 studio computers. They both go into like a digital AES router that goes into, so I'm going like AES out of both of my studio computers. That AES goes to an AES router, which then sends whichever signal I'm choosing to the Trinnov in that AES, and then that's going out AES into the key threes. And so I'm basically like digital right to the speakers. I have a second matched output going through some Lavery converters that go to a Bryston amp and the NS10s in the back. And the key threes are, as you know, it's like an ambisonics microphone. It kind of like knows where the walls are, the relative placement of the speakers. There's an EQ on it. It does additional like phase changes and rebalancing of the speakers to make them really, really clean and natural sounding. And honestly, turning the Trinnov on and off is like night and day for me. It's just like I couldn't I couldn't really work without it. And so I'm working in, I guess, what would, most people would call a compromised space, because it's a room with panels on it and a lot of like really expensive technology, like, $13,000 Key Audio 3 speakers and a $5,000 Trinnov. But to me, it allows me to work in what some would call a not ideal space, but I like the way that this room sounds more than any other room that I've gone to. I had when I was at Drexel, I built a Walter Stork Design Group room with the PMCs, or no, the ATCs, soffit mounted 125s or whatever, with the subs and the tuning system and everything through a Neve console. And like, I couldn't do as good work in that room as I can do in this room. It just doesn't sound as good, like, because I don't get to, every time I get record from or I get feedback from a producer that I respect, or like somebody that I'm working with that I respect, like, it's like a little bit sizzly at 7K. Like, I go into my Trinnov and I make adjustments to kind of constantly reflect the feedback that I'm getting. So my work is getting more and more precise as it goes forward. And, it's, like that, the combination of a Trinnov and a digital cardioid based speaker, like I could probably take most of the acoustics out of here and it would still sound really, really good. It's just like, if you know how to set up a system like that, it's really fantastic. So like the other thing that I do is like, I send out of Pro Tools like 10 dB down, or like 9 dB down. And then the Trinnov turns things down like another 30 dB. But since it's a digital signal, it doesn't necessarily matter too much. That goes to the speakers, and then I'm using my Key Audio 3 as just like a mute button, essentially. I don't change the volume of it ever. I'm just on and off with those. And then the same thing with my headphones for the LCD 5s. And so it is the studio I've built over like 10 years. And it's like hybrid. I can master digitally in here, or I can just like with one button insert my whole analog chain, and it's constant gain. It's all calibrated, so it doesn't raise the volume 0.1 dB at all. It's just perfectly linear. So I can know like whether a digital master or an analog master is going to be better with like one click of a button. It's just perfect. It's just been like, I could not be happier working in this room. It's really beautiful. Is it a lot of money to put all that stuff in a room? Yes. Could I have like purpose built this room and bought some ATCs? I suppose, but there's just something nice about like knowing I can just take this with me anywhere I go. So like I'm thinking about moving to LA for a couple months to just work out there, and I was gonna put my keys and some panels and a Trinnov in my car and just
drive out,
drive out and just keep working that way, So there's kind of like a little bit of flexibility with it, and it's like already a system that I know, and I think I would know it if it was in a different room as well.
Well, that's really encouraging. I think, it can be, I'm a big fan of studio design, and I love acoustics, and that's a big field that I've studied for a long time. And, I chat with guys like Wes Lashow and Philip Newell and the studio guys. They're, sometimes originators of some of the designs like RFCs and non-environment rooms and things like that. But I also work with artists around the world, and the reality of being able to do a purpose-built room like that is not there. And it's nice to see tools like the cardioid designs, like the Dutch and Dutch 8Cs and the keys, and then the Trinnov. I've chatted with those guys a little bit actually, and even systems like SonarWorks. If you don't have the budget for a Trinnov, it can kind of get you part of the way there. Is great and really encouraging to see that you can have a system where you could take it to another environment. It's going to sound similar enough where you feel confident you can work on that. And then of course we've got these guys too. And I know you, I'm on your newsletter, so I saw recently you released a neat article on how you've kind of come to EQ a custom curve for your LCD 5s as well. Maybe you could talk a bit about that, like when are you finding your mixing or engineering in headphones, and what are the differences between that and working on your speakers, and what have you done to kind of adjust or compensate?
Sure. Yeah, I spent I got I've worked in this room for, I think since 2010, I've been making records in this room, and both, all my work since then has been in this room. And so all like the accolades have come from working in this space. So I've just grown to know it so well. But, like when I would travel to go see my parents or like go somewhere for work, work would just pile up, mix notes, print this thing, yada, yada, yada. And I was like, I needed a solution to be outside of the studio and still get this stuff done. Cause it was like the first entry into it was like, it's not critical work. I'm just like essentially making adjustments and pushing buttons, doing mixed notes, pushing buttons. And so like most of the critical work was done. So I was like, let me just find a solution so that I can just like be confident what I'm doing on the road. And so after I got like a sponsorship by Audeze and got a pair of headphones, and the first thing I did was like, okay, I need to match these to my speakers, right? I need to like, when I put these on and then I play the song through my speakers, it needs to feel exactly the same. And I got them. I was so hype on them, and I was like, these don't sound anything like my speakers at all. Like it wasn't even really that close at all. Honestly, they were a little bit brighter, and they were like a little bit more present, and they lacked like really, really deep low end. So what
do you find the top end is a little rolled off too? Like it's a little dark sounding on the top end. You'd made that note, which I noted as well. But in some cases, if you're going for the kind of Bobcats like top tilt, what does he do? It starts at 1K, goes to 20K, and it's 7 dB down by the time you reach 20. Then these actually are a bit more similar to that, not that extreme, but.
So I got the original EQ I got from Bobcats. He sent me his equilibrium preset, and it was good, but it wasn't really aggressive enough. Like it didn't really push things hard enough. And I even think I've updated the EQ since I wrote that blog article. I think I put the presets up, but I should probably update them. But so when I would listen to my speakers, I would basically for like a while, for like 6 months, I would master on my headphones, and then I'd take my headphones off and I'd play the master on my speaker and then make more adjustments to the master till it matched what I thought was acoustically correct. And so I did that for a while. And then like when I made changes on the speakers, I would go to the EQ on the playback EQ for the headphones. I would turn that EQ back on, and I would make adjustments to it until I could basically get to the point where I'd master music on the headphones, take off my headphones, listen to it on speakers with the playback EQ off, and it would be the same thing. I would not make any changes. So then once I got to that point, I was like, okay, I just qualified that I'm getting the same results. The only difference is I'm not using potentially analog. And so that EQ and some crossbeat functionality. Sometimes I use can opener for that, the Good Hertz. And then sometimes I use the crossbleed on I have the Grace M900 headphone amp, which is really nice because it's like ergonomically exactly the same thing as the key. So I just like it. And it sounds really good too, and it's bus powered, so like I can just like be in a hotel room and just like plug it into my laptop, and like I'm not like plugging in multiple things to the wall. It's just really convenient, and it sounds great. It's amazing. And so getting that process down, and I also have it in my studio connected with SPDIF. So when I'm in the studio, it's connected to SPDIF. I can check on headphones, get the exact same thing, and then when I'm on the road, I'm switching to the USB input and I'm getting the exact same thing. So it's the same preamp, same everything. So there's like linearity between it. So I spent a year, matching them, changing the EQ, just trying to make it work. And I got to the point where in some ways I was happier with the headphone masters in some situations. I haven't ventured into mixing with the headphones because I feel like in mastering, you're making more subtle adjustments. You're like within the range of like 2 dB of this and 1 dB of that. And so you're doing much more like reduced extremities of moves, right? But in mixing, I might be like adding like 8 dB or 10 dB of something to the top end and like doing much more extreme processing, which I don't know if the bounds of those extremes are tracked as well in the headphones. But if I'm mastering a record and I have the reference track, which is like the loud version that everybody approved, I have the mix, the pre-master, and then maybe I have like a reference mix of like some commercial release that they particularly like the sound of. Between those three things and having like a really, really acute playback system, I can kind of, I don't feel like, in some ways I feel like I'm making better masters in headphones. Why? Because if I'm in the studio and I'm using all this analog, I feel like I'm applying like value. I'm applying like monetary value. I have like all this expensive stuff. I'm putting all this expensive stuff on it. And I may not be digging in as much as if I take all that stuff away and I say, my master now is just me. It's just me making decisions with these digital tools. I'm now being much more like, I would say, relying on my decision making and my like interpretation of what the music should be, rather than relying on this like kind of splatter of expensive equipment. And that's not to say I just like pass things through the analog and say, okay, the master's done. That's not what's happening. But when there was like a psychological thing that when I was in like Dominican Republic and I was mastering a record for like Drewski and Snoop Dogg that was mixed by Ben Thomas, and I was like, oh shit, this is gonna be a big record. I need to like make sure this is really good. And so I was being really, really acute in my process because I was just like relying solely on digital tools. I was doing so I like went deeper into some RX processing with the de-essing. I went like deeper into like the kind of like the tightness of the EQ approach that I was doing. And then also, you have the memory of all the thousands of other records that you've done. And when you heard things that triggered your echoic memory, the solutions that you came up with. So you have that palette to pull from. So, you can kind of predict a solution before you start, right? Or before you like execute it. And so I just found myself being like, wondering if my mastering was better in headphones being purely digital, because I was being so much more intentful and specific about my work. And because I was like thinking, am I not providing as much value because I'm not applying all this expensive gear? But then because my analog gear is like perfectly gain matched, so it's like 0 dB in is 0 dB out, or -10 in is -10 out, and I can turn it on and off when I'm in the studio. If I'm working on like club records or rap records, and I turn on the analog gear, I'm not always convinced that it's better. And so I'd say 60% of the time I'm turning it off and I'm doing a purely digital master. And I've been in like, when I was in LA, I went to like some of the biggest mastering studios, the biggest mastering studios, and their decision-making process was not much different. I'll just say that. And so, the like GoldClip is, and I also use a bunch of like custom software that are future plugins of mine that are not out. And so I have like 3 mastering tools that I'm using right now that are not like publicly out plugins. They're just like things in beta that I'm using as AU. And so, there's many different ways to do things. I think a lot of times people assume analog is better because it's more expensive. It has a physicality to it and it feels more tangible. But I just have noticed more and more that when I lean into digital and the precision of it, and when you are really specific about the digital tools that you choose and the way that you use them, I have found that I can get things much more clean, if I want clean, much more precise, and much more just like powerful sounding, sticking to an all digital master. Now, if I'm doing like rock records and stuff where,
it's different.
It's different. Yeah. And so it is genre specific. But the digital tools now are exceptional, and coming as like a plugin developer, obviously I'm going to say that. But
you would also know.
Yeah, but I'm preaching, I'm like, it's in my practice as well. I'm like, it's not just like something I say, like I'm actually, I felt really guilty when I stopped using my analog. Before it was just like every single record I did, every single time. I used the analog equipment. And it took me a while to get to the point where I would say, like, is this the best thing for the record? And I wasn't just doing that because I wanted to like be outside the studio. I was like in the studio being like, damn, I think this sounds better without that stuff. And I don't know why it was so hard for me to get over that hurdle of just like accepting that things are better without it.
That's the ultimate test. And it's so easy for us when we've invested a lot of money into things to really want to use them. And I think that, in the same way that our ears can be fooled by small increases in loudness, all of our other senses can be really easily manipulated as well and manipulated. Yeah, man. Wow. Well, I feel like we need to do a whole nother interview at some point talking more about your mixing and mastering work and things like that. But I think we'll kind of bring things to a close for now. And huge thank you for your time and your experience. I know any engineer like you've got, like you said, always a backlog of work. There's always lots going on. And even if you're not working in the studio, you're working on your plugins, I know. And so I just want to say thank you from myself and from everybody who's going to see this for spending the time with us today. And what are the best ways for people to engage with you for all the various different things you do? Where would you like me to send people? Because I can include some links below in the show notes.
My two websites, ryanschwabe.com, schwabedigital.com, are a great place to connect with me. DMing on Instagram. I'm on that thing a lot, unfortunately, but it seems to be a really great vehicle for connecting with artists and producers and engineers. You can email me. My email is ryan@schwabedigital.com. And those are probably the easiest places. And I just want to thank you for, having this channel and having, this space for people to come and talk and share their work. It's really important. So thank you.
Right on, man. Yeah. I love being able to do this. I love teaching. I love engineering, the geeky side of it. I love learning about new tools. And it's also great to meet colleagues in the industry, and I've really enjoyed our connection, and I hope we can keep chatting, and I'd love to continue to teach people about the work that you're doing and to represent the amazing plugins that you're building. So we'll have some more videos coming down the road soon about the clippers and about the new plugins that you have in the mix.
I look forward to it, man. Appreciate you so much, man.
Right on. Thanks so much, Ryan.
All right, you take care.